Well, good evening, everyone. Yes, I thought perhaps this evening we'd sort of talk under the title, It's Not What You Think. Um, I guess at some point that those words have come off of all of our lips, haven't they? Whether we were as young people or as children, or sometimes, we've kind of been busy with something. Somebody walks into the room and they give us, they speak to us, and our response to them is, "It's not what you think." Or perhaps somebody has accused us of something. They've heard that we said something, or we were misquoted, or heard that we did something, and they take us to task on it. And our response is, "It's not what you think. It's not what you think." It's interesting how things can be confused just by their similarity or by context. And one person's reading of context can give a different interpretation than another's. So this evening, we're going to just talk a little around that. In 2020, a scrap metal dealer in the United States bought a small gold ornament from an antiques market. He paid what was not a small sum, nearly $13,500 for the little egg-shaped trinket, probably not more than about 10 or 15 centimeters high. His plan was to sell it on to a scrap jewelry dealer, who would then remove all the various parts and recycle the gold. And he was hoping he would get about $15,000 for it, but he couldn't find someone to buy it at that price. And so he hung on to it, and it kind of sat in his kitchen for a few years. And one day he decided to do a bit more research on it. He followed the name on the little clock that was part of it, and he made a discovery. He had his hunch verified, and it turns out that this little egg-shaped trinket that he bought for $13,500 was in fact one of 50 Fabergé eggs made for the imperial family of Russia, for the Romanovs. The eggs were lost during the revolution, and although there'd been efforts to regather much of the state treasures that had been sold off to raise money for the new government, 8 of them had remained missing. And this little egg that he picked up in a market was one of the missing 8 eggs, worth $33 million. Not a bad investment, from 13.5 to $33 million. He looked at that little egg a little differently every day after that. In fact, I believe he sold it on to a collector. But it was not what he thought. Suddenly, a piece of information that he gained gave him a different perspective on this little scrap metal egg. Context helped him realize it was not what he thought. I shift you to another. I'd hope to perhaps share a few pictures with you this evening, but perhaps these will come a little later. It looks, if you were to see it, like a dinosaur tooth. It's milky white, it's irregular in shape. It weighs about 27 kilograms and is estimated to be 1,000 years old. But it's not a fossil. It is an organic thing. It is, in fact, the Geiger pearl, the largest pearl known to humanity, or at least at this point in time. Inherited actually by a Canadian Filipino gentleman who inherited it from his aunt, who had been given it in the clam by her father. And it had sat, some say, under the bed in a box, and some say it was displayed from time to time on her mantelpiece. And now the gentleman who owns it uses it to speak about environmental issues. This little, not so little, 27 kilogram pearl was not desired by any of the other members of the family and was sent on to this gentleman as a little memento of his aunt. Well, this 27-kilogram pearl is worth $90 million. It's not what they thought. And I wonder how many family members were kicking themselves sore when they realized they'd passed up a $90 million pearl. You know, each of the items that I've mentioned has a story that is fascinating, a story that is complex, as are most of our human stories. The story of God and humanity is equally fascinating and complex. And like any other story, yours or mine, indeed, it shouldn't be oversimplified, because when we do so, we end up with kind of a cartoon version of the story. And we lose some of the depth and the breadth and the passion and the pathos that comes with the story. You know, Jesus told stories often in his ministry. And it's helpful, I think, for me to think of his stories almost like he's talking about the kingdom of God, if it's a big grand room or building. And if from time to time, as we walk through the building with him, he opens up a window and he says to us through a parable, let's look at it from this perspective for a few minutes. And that's what I'd like to do, kind of take you into just a very short parable that Jesus tells in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. It's just 2 verses, 45 and 46, and I'll read them for you before we kind of unpack it a little bit and see what it says to us about our lives, about meaning, about value, and perhaps along the lines of, it's not what you think. So Jesus says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away, sold it. Sold everything he had, and bought it. It's a very, very brief parable. It's only a few verses long, and really it says hardly anything at all. But maybe that doesn't matter, because probably we've heard this parable many times before. And like the parable of the treasure in the field, we're pretty sure that we know what it means, that we've got the meaning sorted. And so we're ready to move on to something that's got a bit more depth and breadth and is a little more zippy and jazzy and a bit more exciting than just a 2-line story. Allow me to suggest to you that this little parable is not what you think. You know, most often in his ministry, Jesus told parables about agricultural sorts of things, about seeds and farmers, and he told stories about money and merchants. In fact, did you know that Jesus spoke more about money than most other things? And that's a bit tricky for us sometimes when we have our things that we want to make very, very important. But one of the things Jesus spoke most about was our relationship with material things. The things that Jesus spent most of his time talking about, it seems, were those activities, those pictures, those scenes that most would have had some knowledge of. The people that were listening to Jesus, they knew about corruption in the highest levels of government. They knew about being intimidated into paying more tax than they needed to. And most of them, to be fair, had probably at some point hidden something valuable in the ground to hide it from the tax collectors as they came around, and then had to go and find it afterwards. So the idea of perhaps finding somebody else's buried treasure in a field, not so far-fetched. They could identify with the servant who buried his 1 talent in the ground, because they weren't sure if they could really trust things like bankers and other enterprises where people were often regularly taken advantage of. You know, in some ways, and in those things, perhaps their world is not so different from our own, or ours so different from theirs. They could also identify with the story of someone being thrown into prison until he could pay his debt. And probably most people knew somebody that had happened to. They could probably imagine the likelihood of finding all kinds of links to the stories that Jesus told. But most of those listening to Jesus would never have seen a pearl. And even if they had, they would not own enough property or assets to raise the funds to purchase one, even if it was available for sale. You see, a pearl in the time of Jesus was a luxury item. As in today, you can't eat a pearl, you can't drink it, and you can't keep warm from it. A pearl will not work for you like, say, an ox or a horse. It cannot provide you with milk or eggs. It won't help you plow a field. And all that a pearl was really good for was to look at, to admire, to own even, as a status symbol, something that you could use to show off your wealth. Of course, we use other items today as a way of showing off our status and our wealth, where we have some of the same challenges that they had. So basically, if you could afford something as beautiful and as useless as a pearl, then you were somebody. The ancient historian Pliny, and I'm not expecting many of us to have read too much about him, he says that pearls were the topmost rank among all things of price. Literally, their value was above rubies. They were the most expensive gemstone of the ancient world. So when Jesus talks about a merchant who flogs everything he has in order to buy a pearl, he's talking about somebody who has resources, somebody who has assets, somebody who has much, 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 much more than most of the people that were listening to Jesus. You know, there is a story. I mentioned you can't drink a pearl and you can't eat a pearl, but there is a story from the ancient world in which Cleopatra famously wagered Mark Antony. And if you hope you know a little bit about Cleopatra, she was quite an astute woman who ruled Egypt for a period of time in a very politically dangerous setting. And Rome was seeking to make Egypt one of the provinces, and she was trying to keep her life and her throne. And so she played two men at the same time. I'm not advising this to anybody. I'm not suggesting that this is something you should do, and it's probably a cycle she needed to break. But she was courting Mark Antony, who was a general, and she was courting Caesar. So she was playing it very, 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 very precariously. She once bet Mark Antony that she could consume 10 million sesterces in one banquet. Now, 10 million sesterces is roughly the equivalent of £1 million today. Now, I would like to see anybody, man or woman, who can put away that value of food in one banquet. And even if you're eating some of the most expensive foods available to us today, that's still quite a feat to achieve. It's said that during the banquet, she ate very, very simply. She ate very little at all, to the point that Mark Antony thought he was going to absolutely win this bet. And then when it came to the dessert courses, a servant brought her a dish with a pool of vinegar in it. She took out one of her matching pearl earrings, put it in the vinegar, allowed it to dissolve, and then drank it. And so consumed 10 million sesterces in one meal. Now that gives you a sense of the value of the pearl. Remember, it was one of a pair. So one was worth about £1 million today. Now, why were pearls so valuable? Well, it had to do with how they were sourced. A pearl was a relatively rare and expensive thing in the ancient world. It was the sort of thing, I suppose, to which Isaiah referred in chapter 55, verse 22. He says, "Why do you spend money on that which is not bread, and your earnings for that which does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good, and let your soul delight in abundance." the thing that made pearls so expensive was the way they were sourced. You couldn't rely on clams or oysters or mussels washing up on the shore and opening each one and hoping they might have a decent sized pearl, something that was beautiful inside. In order to procure the best pearls, you needed divers, free divers, who generally would dive to the mussel beds at 10, 15, 20 meters. But sometimes the very best pearls could only be found at depths of around 40 meters. To dive without oxygen, without any other assistance, and just what's in your lungs to that depth, bearing in mind that in order to get 3 or 4 good-sized pearls worthy of expensive sale, you needed to raise about a ton of mussels. Let's just percolate that around in your mind for a little bit. 1 ton of shellfish in order to get 3 or 4 worthy pearls. So the Bible doesn't say a great deal about pearls. The one famous thing we know about pearls is that Revelation talks about the gates of the New Jerusalem being made of pearl. And the only thing that sort of makes sense to us is, of course, the color or the luster, the shine of the pearls. But in that scenario, they're building material and they're of a size and nature that we don't know anything about. The parable talks about pearls, yes, but it also talks about merchants. Now, a merchant in our time is we would call them a businessman, I suppose. It's a fairly respectable profession, and some of you may indeed be thinking to go into business and making your living that way. And if you do so, I'm sure you'll do well. And I'm sure that you will bring a measure of integrity and honesty to the business world that may be sorely needed. But in Bible times, the word merchant kind of had a negative connotation to it. And it kind of had this idea that a merchant was somebody who sells things to consumers that they don't need at prices they can't afford. And it made me wonder, are we buying anything we don't need at prices we can't afford? Is the parable saying something to us about the values that we place on things and the things that we are willing to sell our lives for, the things that we are willing to give up so much in order to obtain? Are they absolutely really worth all of that energy and effort, the selling of our hearts and our minds in order to obtain them? You know, merchants and marketplaces are mentioned in the incident when Jesus clears the temple. The two things are not used in positive connotations, either in the ancient world or in Bible times, because the merchant is somebody who crosses boundaries. He's always kind of trespassing, as it were. The merchant is always about business. He's always about the deal. He's always about getting in ahead and making the sale. The merchant goes from one place to another, to the point that some people would think of merchants as quite shifty people. How can you trust them if they're never in one place? How do you trust people where you don't know their family? You don't know where they're rooted? These were the things that were of importance in the ancient world. We needed to know your name. We needed to know your family. We needed to know your family history. Before we can kind of do a deal with you, we need to know what kind of a person you are. We need to have the measure of you. And a merchant, at least in the connotations we're talking about, is seldom in a place long enough for anyone to know that sort of thing, which means he's potentially shifty. Who are the people he's allied to? What are the things that he's doing? Is he selling secrets, gathering information, selling them on the side, on top of what he's actually doing? Is he a double agent? You know, is he safe? Can we trust him? But on top of it all, he's not selling the stuff that was truly important in the ancient world. The truly important stuff for most people was land, family, and truth. Those three things were the most important things. Those three things rooted you in a place. They allowed you to have a livelihood over a period of time. Of course, in our world, many of us have moved all over the place. I myself and my family no longer live in the countries that we were born into, and we live far away from the families that raised us. In some ways, I suppose, by the measure of the ancient world, we too could be a bit shifty in the sense that we haven't got deep enough roots. And it's one of the things that challenges me to think about how I am in community, thinking about how do I build that credibility? How do I have a sense of place and a sense of loyalty to place and to the people of that place? And so in this little parable of Jesus, this merchant does an unthinkable thing, really. He sinks all that he has and all that his family has into one beautiful, magnificent gem. Now, it may be a very beautiful pearl. It may be unusually large. It may be curiously shaped. But the truth be told, that pearl cannot feed him or clothe him. It cannot shelter him, cannot shelter his family. And so, having made the purchase, we expect to hear a little bit more in the parable. Has he got a buyer lined up? Does he have something planned for this pearl? Is there a bigger deal that it's part of? There must be some wonderful return on an investment that takes everything you have in order to obtain it. But the parable doesn't tell us. All the parable tells us is that he obtained the pearl at great cost. And having fully owned it, possessing it, it appears in the parable that he does nothing with it. And so, in a sense, if the parable is all that there is to know, then he ceases to be a merchant, because a merchant must continue to trade. If he does not sell the pearl, he has not only surrendered his trading supplies, not only has he given up his family's security and provision, but he has also given up his identity as a merchant. So what is he now? Who knows? A collector? An eccentric? Somebody who's asset rich and cash poor? Certainly. The merchant, or the man, is no longer what we think. And so there we have it, the two main characters or objects in the parable, both with negative connotations, the merchant and the pearl. And we must wonder to ourselves, what on earth is Jesus on about? Well, it's not what you think. Or is it? The Bible says again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. And when he had found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. A more literal translation says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man, a merchant, selling fine pearls, and on finding one of extremely great value, sold everything he had and bought it. I suggest to you that Jesus is speaking about himself, that he is talking about the mission of God and about the values of God's kingdom. Like a merchant, somewhat distrusted and foreign, God crosses the boundaries of the universe, and he comes to our world, a world that has earlier rejected him, and a world that actually looks at him as a stranger and a foreigner, as someone who in many ways is even unwelcome to the experience that we have. There may even be a sense of, who are you? Who are you to say anything to us? Who are you to bring anything of value into our experience? What do you know about us? What do you know about what it means to be us? But he, if we follow the story of the scriptures, is also the God who not only crosses the boundaries of the universe, but he is the one who steps from the holy into the sinful, from the atmosphere of glory into the barren lands of disgrace. He journeys among us, not as some wealthy overlord, but as one among us, one with us, God with us, Emmanuel, Jesus Christ, growing up as a carpenter's boy in Nazareth, The place that Nathanael said, "Oh, can any good thing even come from that place?" That's the place that he comes to journey and be with us. And he does that in order to obtain a pearl of great price, something that indeed would cost everything that he had. It's a picture of Messiah, really, a glimpse, if you like, into the heart of God, into this complex and layered story of God and humanity. The pearl of great price and the treasure in the field sing in harmony with 1 Timothy 2, verse 6, that says, "There is one mediator between God and mankind, the man Jesus Christ, who gave himself as a ransom for all people." And with John 3:16, which says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believe in him should not perish but have eternal life." It sounds very much like the merchant who gives everything he has in order to obtain a pearl of great price. The parable is perhaps not what we thought it was, but there's also a challenge in the parable. You know, parables are there to challenge us, to awaken in us something about a new way, about the kingdom way. And like the pearl, produced only because of an irritant that got into the shell of a mollusk, perhaps it invites us to ask ourselves, how are we being shaped by the knocks of our day-to-day lives? You know, the shellfish, in order to produce a pearl, secretes nacre to coat the irritant, to smooth it over, and to make it more comfortable to live with. Pearls are beautiful, but there is a tragic and painful side to them. They only come about because something untoward, something uncomfortable, entered the shell of a mollusk. For the Geiger pearl, in the Geiger clam, it spent nearly 1,000 years, we suspect, coating an irritant in order to make it more comfortable to live with. That's quite a picture right there. Now, I'm not saying, and please don't go away thinking that this is what I'm saying. I'm not saying that all kinds of abuse, of bullying and oppression, that they ultimately have some wonderful purpose of producing something beautiful in your life. These are things that we should call by their name. We should name them for what they are, and we should resist them at every opportunity. But they are the bumps and the scrapes and the hurts and the scratches and the wounds that we gather from being human, from moving through this world, being in relationship with other people. As somebody once said, you can get better or you can get bitter. And sometimes we choose to be bitter. I've chosen to be bitter before. That's the honest truth. But bitterness is something that begins to eat away. It removes some of your compassion. It reduces your humanity, and it leads you to begin to see others as less. That is not something that I want to be investing in producing in my life. And so if I am going to move through this life, and I'm going to be bumped and scraped, and I'm going to be wounded by my interactions with others, then perhaps I could take a little lesson from the pearl in the sense of, what is it that I choose to produce from that? And perhaps there's something beautiful in my character that can be produced by learning ways to deal healthily and meaningfully with those interactions. But there's also the challenge from the merchant, isn't there? This merchant who becomes quite focused on one thing and one thing only. And it asks us really a simple question that is so difficult to answer. To what will we surrender our identity? What is so great a find in your life that it would lead you to give up everything For some people, that is love. For some people, they are willing to give up family, friendships, everything for the sake of being in love with this one person, and devoting all of their energy and focus onto this one person whom they desire to love above all others. And sometimes that works out really well, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's a career. This evening we were praying for those who are thinking about their careers, having to make decisions, and there are some paths that you choose that will require everything you have and more. Your energy, your time, your relationships, a career path that will absorb all of those things and set them aside for the sake of achieving well. And those are valuable goals to have. Sometimes we just need to be aware of the price that will be paid when we make the choice. I think most of us, if we were the family of the merchant, would have taken him aside and said to him, "This is a reckless thing you're doing, man. How can you do this? If I was the brother of that merchant, or I was the brother-in-law, if he was married to my sister, I'd want to say to him, man, are you crazy? How can you do this? My sister's, what about your... We would have things to say to the man. You can't be foolish. You have responsibilities. But we should also give him credit for having the courage to change his life because something spoke to him, something called him. The merchant is able to identify his ultimate concern. And when he does, he becomes single-minded about it. Now, let's be frank. The parable is not asking you to sell everything you have and go and buy a pearl. That's not what the parable is encouraging you to do. It's not asking you to be bankrupt. It's not asking you to be asset rich and cash poor. In fact, it's not really about any of those things. But it is inviting us to grapple with the question, what is worth so much that we will allow it to absorb all of what we are, including our identity? What is being sold to you, to me, at prices we cannot afford? And are we willing to pay those prices? As we struggle with who we are, with those layered identities, those stories that each one of us has, that is complex and intricate and wonderful and sad and heartbreaking and joyful, as we battle with competing and powerful influences, as we make our way through a changed and changing world, what has our committed attention? What are our desires? And as we keep seeking the next thing, the better thing, as we work through our bucket lists and our heart's desires, perhaps knowing what our one precious pearl is will cancel out some of the unnecessary peripheral things that may distract us. In knowing your pearl of great price, you may also come to know that it will demand a new way of living from you, because you cannot obtain your pearl without it requiring absolute priority in your life. And that is the challenge of the parable. But it is also the story of the parable, because it's a reminder that you and I are of utmost and wonderful value to God. The Greek word for pearl is margarita. And perhaps some of you are smiling because you're thinking of the pizza. And some of you are thinking about other things. But perhaps that new piece of information adds some meaning to the expression pearly gates. A teacher discussing the passage with a class of students shared this little bit of Bible trivia. And one of her students took the opportunity to share. A recovering alcoholic, she explained how the margarita, the drink, was her pearl of complete value. That she had sold everything she had given up everything she had in pursuit of this drink. Her pearl demanded everything she had. But at some point you had to find a new way to live. Discovering that you are the pearl of great price when it comes to the kingdom of God invites us each to find a new way to live, to break the cycle, and to live afresh.